Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, the go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, and today's episode is all about nanofertilizers. So what do we mean when we talk about nanotechnology and things like this? It's basically anything that is 1 to 100 nanometers in size. So what is a nanometer? Well, when we think of a meter, we obviously know what a meter is. If you're anywhere outside of the US, and then a centimeter, 100th of a meter, a millimeter is 1,000th of a meter, and you can just about see that with the naked eye. We'll divide one of those millimeters by 1,000, and you get a micrometer, and divide one of those micrometers by 1,000 again, you get a nanometer. And so these are particles of fertilizer that are 1 to 100 nanometers in diameter. So these are compounds that would not normally be soluble, but when you put them to nanoscale, they do interesting things. And so they can be absorbed by plant cells and other cells, and they can move systemically, whereas they wouldn't have moved systemically before. So there's been a lot of interest in nanofertilizers over the years, and we're going to talk about some of them. So first of all, why might you want to use a nanofertilizer? Higher nutrient use efficiency would be the first one. If you can put a much smaller amount in, but get it absorbed better, maybe through a foliar application, rather than a soil drench that's just going to be wasted and be absorbed by the cells in the leaf and the foliage. You could get targeted and controlled release over certain time periods and certain temperatures, and greater uptake at the root surface. So studies have shown that nanofertilizers can increase nutrient uptake by over 30% and boost yields by over 20% in soil systems and hydroponic systems. However, that is with a caveat, and I'll talk about that later. Now, a lot of nanofertilizers are iron oxide nanoparticles, and they're 30 nanometer super paramagnetic particles. They show promise in hydroponics, and it's thought that they can increase iron levels in things like potatoes and even starch concentration. However, iron wouldn't have been my first choice to experiment with when it comes to nanofertilizers, because yes, iron oxide is insoluble in water, but there are loads of soluble forms of iron. And when you think about solubility, a soluble form of iron is even smaller than a nanoparticle. And so things like iron chelates are readily available for both hydroponics and soil cultivation. So why start with iron when that's one of the nutrients you can get into plants on foliars very easily, as long as it's chelated? So my first choices would have been silicon and boron. Silicon, while not an essential element, strengthens cell walls, improves disease resistance and tolerance. And so nanosilica could bind to roots, it could bind to the flowers, the fruits, the cells, and it could provide silicon in an easily absorbable form. And crucially, it could do it without any pH issues or without the need for synthetic solvents and surfactants. So that would have been my first choice. And my second choice would have been boron, because boron's essential for cell division and reproduction, improves chlorophyll photosynthesis, but boron is one of the few nutrients there's not a good chelated form of it. Utrema were working on a chelated form of boron that uses natural chelation, but it would have been a good one for nanotechnology. There's lots of people who've looked at nanotechnology over the last 10, 15 years. There's a lot of nanofertilizers coming out of Taiwan. I think they're manufactured, and you can get them. Because they're basically a suspension fertilizer. A suspension fertilizer is a product where the fertilizer ingredients are not actually solubilized; they're floating around in an emulsion or suspension, and they weigh a lot because of that. So they're often very heavy. You can get silicon nanofertilizers out of Taiwan. There's a lot of research done at Nottingham Trent University in the UK by Dr. Gareth Cave, and there they were linking the nanoparticle to an amino acid for even more improved delivery, because they'd seen a lot of positive effects on animal nutrition. So they were looking to expand that into plant health, and they launched a range called Nano 9, I think, that was in the hydroponic industry for a while. I don't think it's around anymore, but it's not potentially the end of that story. Obviously, we've talked about the enhanced uptake, delivery, better control release dynamics. When we talk about controlled release, control release fertilizers are often like granules that involve plastics and non-biodegradables. So if you could get a biodegradable controlled release nanofertilizer, that would be great. But what are the problems? What are the issues that stop nanofertilizers being commercialized? And the big one is that you get particle aggregation. They can scale, the nanoparticles can clump together, reduce bioavailability. And so a nanoparticle suddenly becomes a microparticle, and its performance, its properties radically change then. Stability in solution, coated nanoparticles must resist pH and nutrient impacts. Iron nanotrials show good stability though, but we've seen clumping in our lab with nanoparticles over time. And then there's regulatory oversight. Nanoparticles face growing scrutiny, and in certain countries, they may be banned. And nanotubes as well. Have you ever looked into nanotubes? There's a lot of research looking at nanotubes could improve water uptake in roots, but at the same time, they could also be highly toxic to humans. So I think they are banned, and nanofertilizers might be banned in the US. Let me know. If you've listened to this podcast and you know whether nanofertilizers are allowed in the US, that would be interesting. So if you've ever researched or used nanofertilizers and seen a good effect compared to standard fertilizers, let me know. A lot of the early studies showed really, really high increases in yield that were too good to be true. A former boss of mine who used to work for DuPont said, if you see a study that shows an increase in yield above, I think it was like 10%, you can just ignore it. So, increases yield of 80%, that's really, the plants must have been growing in suboptimal conditions. So they must have been highly stressed to see an effect that dramatic. So, but nanofertilizers remain a potential really interesting area, especially in those nutrients I talked about, silicon and boron, and potentially other, some of the macronutrients as well, if we could deliver them. If we could stop phosphorus lockout, that would be a really good one. Or calcium and phosphorus, stop them from interacting. When mixed together in standard fertilizers, that would be good. And that's already happens in gold leaf and liquid gold. The calcium and the phosphorus don't interact with its unique technology, but there could be other options for once arable crops hit the soil to stop calcium and phosphorus from interacting. So keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on research coming out of the universities and see where chemistry and biology interact and where academia and industry interact. So I'm Dr. Russell Sharps. Thank you, Sharp. Thank you for tuning in to Hydroponics Daily. If you would like to know more about nanofertilizers, if you want to discuss them further, just email me and or comment on wherever you are getting this, and I'm more than happy to talk about it, or can even do a clarification. If you've got a novel nano product that you'd like to talk about in hydroponics or in horticulture in general, then drop me a line. And if you are in the nano industry and someone's sent you this episode for you to listen to, then you owe that person a pint. And if you could do me a favor as well and screenshot your podcast provider on your phone as you see this, and then share it to social media and say, I listened to this and it was a really good episode, that would be amazing, because that would help me grow the community listening to Hydroponics Daily. Until tomorrow, that's been Hydroponics Daily, Nanofertilizers.